On the 12th of January 2020, citizens in a 10-kilometer radius of the Pickering nuclear generating station was pinged an emergency message onto their mobile devices. These messages warned that there was a reported incident, but that there was no abnormal release of radioactivity. Now, not all countries do this, but in Canada, we get little alerts from time to time. Often a missing persons report to look out for certain vehicles to report to the police. And for the most part, it works. These Amber Alerts draw attention to what emergency services need and allows a broader set of eyes to look out for something important. But this alert was different. In the news, it was reported to be an accident, a mistake by the plant when performing a routine training exercise, similar to the false missile alert sent out to the state of Hawaii, but a takeaway success that their system works should an actual event like this happen. But I'm one of the few people that can tell you, it wasn't a mistake. Nor was the information in the false warning correct. It was something much worse. The Pickering nuclear generating plant publicly began construction in 1966. Back then, they had been upfront about the idea to power a large front of the Ontario region. And right now, it sits as one of the oldest nuclear power plants in the world and one of the largest. On the surface, everything seems sound. An investment was made and the owners and workers are doing their best to get the most out of it. But when you look deeper into the plant, you'll find that a number of discrepancies start to peel away the veneer of the plant, and you may get a glimpse of what's really going on. There were 2 stations at the plant, stations A and B. These stations had a few differences and also a number of similarities, notably a shared vacuum building, a negative pressure containment chamber. After cuts to Station A, in which Units 2 and 3 were shut down, Station A and B were merged into one unit. There's one word there that should have stuck out to you, something which paves the way to the truth behind the Pickering power plant: containment. In the 1960s, something so wild and dangerous warranted the government, and maybe even societies we don't even know of, to filter millions into a power plant front, all to create the perfect containment conditions for this creature. Not many were around to even give witness to such a creature, and many less are around today to even ask whether it be of natural or unnatural causes of death. More is known about the containment itself, as they had to pull in trusted workers to man the glorified cell 25-8. I was one of these grunts. I'd worked my way through various engineering jobs in various plants, which caught the notice of the Pickering owners. I first thought this was a fantastic opportunity, a recognition of my skill in this craft. Little did I know, they just wanted more meat for the grinder. I did my due research before moving to Ontario. I found out there were a number of incidents previously and prepared to pick their brains in order to show initiative, and that I wanted to push the plant forward into a safer direction. I wanted to look diligent in management's eyes. This didn't go down as expected. I was interviewed in a room full of other prospective-looking workers. We went through a series of tests and interviews, though in hindsight, these interviews played out more like an interrogation. Each time I pushed back a question about the plant, in my mind trying to look informed, they would clam up and write something down. After a few instances of this, I took it as a sign to shut my mouth. In the end, those who accepted the role were given the job. It seemed more like a song and dance, and that we were all already chosen for the job. All we had to do was accept. Throughout all this, one good thing did come of it. I met another like-minded engineer. Adrian was marginally older than me, with salt and pepper hair to show his medals of experience. If it wasn't for meeting Adrian and wanting to work with such an interesting person, I probably would have turned down the role. We started almost immediately, moved near site in some pop-up houses built specially for workers. Adrian managed to get his whole family moved to the company's expense, and over time I shared many a meal with them. It seemed like the budget for our level of work was a bit absurd how high it was, but obviously that's something you don't want to question. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, as they say. The contracts were aggressive. NDAs, lifetime silence about corporate dealings, promises to never share anything with the media. But the promises they made us make, compared to the money thrown at us, we thought what we were signing up for was more than worth it. Little did we know that that was the bait on the end of the hook. Our first day could only be described as indoctrination. We were sent to these classes that just spilled the beans. We were assaulted with corrections on anything we had or hadn't heard about the place. Something I researched beforehand was an incident on the 1st of August 1983. It was reported that the pressure tube in G16 in the now defunct Pickering A Unit 2 developed a 2-meter long split. Workers managed to safely shut down the reactor and investigate the damage. In the various articles about the incident, the cause was pinned on the mislocation of the annulus gas spacer springs, which allowed the hot pressure tube to sag and touch the inside of the cold calandria tube, leading to the hydrogen enrichment of the cooler areas. This led to small cracks, which built up and eventually caused a long rupture. No pictures were taken for obvious reason, and the reporters simply took the professional's word on face value. This was an utter farce. The damage wasn't built up on a pressure tube, but rather some expanse of protective wall. What we were shown were numerous pictures of the damages developing, the splits all building up over a series of time-lapse snapshots. However, something which was too perfect to be an accident was the pattern of threes. Each new mark with 3 perfectly parallel scores. Through much denial at the preposterous idea, it was too hard not to think that they looked almost like scratch marks. The final slide was of the outside, through the thin 2-meter long gash that was visible from the other side. The faintest image visible through the narrow slit was what looked like an eye. Incident after incident was revealed to cover a more sinister truth. On the 10th of December 1994, there was a, quote, loss of coolant accident reported. It was said to be the most serious accident in Canadian history in 2001 by the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment and Natural Resources. The emergency core cooling system was used to prevent a meltdown. They say that the best way to lie is to admit something embarrassing. This was the most extreme example of that. Such a huge farce was taken as a miracle of avoiding catastrophe. If only it was a nuclear explosion that was the threat. Whatever is contained deep within the Pickering nuclear plant, it wanted out. And throughout the years, it was getting closer and closer at achieving its freedom. On the 14th of March 2011, it was announced that there was a leak of 73 cubic meters of demineralized water into Lake Ontario from a failed pump. However, a statement was made that there was negligible risk to the public. Life moved on, but internally, it was noted that whatever was contained was searching for more than one route of exit, and it had found the liquid pumps that time. These were just the announced incidents you can find on Wikipedia, but more undocumented cases were revealed in our week of indoctrination. Whether it was fear of consequence or a feeling of patriotic duty to help contain what was inside for the greater good of the Canadian people, and maybe even the North American continent, we who stayed dutifully took to the tasks provided. We worked diligently to make sure everything went smoothly. Had this been a normal nuclear plant, with a much overqualified staff, this should have been a cakewalk. However, this wasn't a normal plant, and the circumstances were more dire than what was implied in the dread-inducing seminars. We worked tirelessly to patch up problems sprouting all over the plant. They cropped up at a frequency much higher than normal rate. we definitely passed all levels of legal working hours, and many provincial safety standards were ignored in favour of hasty results. It was obvious why a huge new batch of experienced recruits were brought in. It had been a while since a major incident, and it was quickly implied that a big one was looming. Adrian and I were a dream team. We often went above and beyond what was expected, bouncing off each other in both experience and motivation. We very quickly became the go-to guys for higher level threats and incidents. What we found when studying the schematics of the plant was a huge empty space located almost in the centre of both facilities. When Station A and B were separate, it was to optimise two different workflows. One worked on the power aspect, providing the face of the company, whilst the other purely worked on containment. However, over the years, improvements were made in both areas, and it was found that combining both stations was now more efficient. Thus, the merge of both stations was initiated. What took more digging was when we found out that this was actually in an effort to harness some form of energy from whatever was inside. It explained the higher output, despite the closure of various units in both stations. How they did this is years beyond my understanding, but what they didn't account for was the effect it had on the creature's behaviour. Lashes of energy and movement would sporadically happen without notice, and the game of cat and mouse began, with the creature creating a problem and the workers scrambling to fix it in time. The publicly reported incidents being the close calls of failure. We sussed out through subtle questions to the higher-ups that the inner chamber had many layers. It was conceived originally as overkill, that the original many-meter-thick wall would contain whatever was inside, and that the other two were an unnecessary precaution. But now that whatever was inside had long since cracked the first two, what many people, even internally, didn't know was that we were on the last line of defense. Things were more critical than we thought. It all came to a head when our entire complex was woken by an alarm we had never heard before, something which we all took to mean all hands on deck. We hastily threw on our work gear and made our way to the plant. An identical alarm was simultaneously going off at the plant, which confirmed our suspicions. This was serious. Fires were being handled by the on-site firefighters that bravely pushed back the infernos, threatening to overheat critical systems. Many technicians were redirecting cooling and airflow to alleviate any kind of meltdown. That left us, the engineers, to chase down any physical problems and patch them up ASAP. All the while, huge scrapings and bangs could be heard echoing through the thick metal walls of the center chamber. Whatever it was fighting as hard as it could to get out, and it was now our job to stop it. Hours went by, constantly an uphill battle. It was the hydra of problems. Fix one, and two more took its place. On top of that, whatever we did fix, we did in such a shoddy manner that they threatened to undo at any moment, if they didn't already immediately after. Exhaustion took many of us out, and worst of all, a new problem arose. There was a huge set of metal panels that looked like they were the last panels to complete the central chamber. What we never pieced together, nor were we informed, was that these panels weren't just the last panels to what was probably the most secure room in existence. It was a door, and it was opening. Due to the weight, it took an incredible amount of mechanics for the most minuscule of movement, topped off by the fact that this was made with a peak of 70s technology. This curse was our blessing, as we had a number of hours before it would open. But what is ordinarily an ample amount of time for troubleshooting was now a dire deadline. Panic shot through the labs and facilities. Many scrambled to get into any of the old schematics, non-digitalized, whilst some fled, choosing to abandon their posts in the futile ideas of escape. The faintest gunshots showed the level of tolerance the higher-ups had about deserters. For every inch the door opened, we were studying up on the complicated engineering that went into such an amazing contraption. The project was years ahead of its time, but due to the era-based technology, it gave us a chance to grasp the blueprints in a timely manner. However, no matter what we troubleshot, nothing turned up why it was opening. As time passed on, it became harder to concentrate on our studies, while all we could hear was the deafening bangs that sent shockwaves throughout the entire facility. The looming realization that whatever it was that was locked away long ago was tantalizingly close to its freedom. And it was getting motivated. Armed personnel, dressed as scientists and lab assistants that were seemingly undercover, stood at the forefront of the opening now, firing away, fighting in any way they possibly could. The red smear at the opening being the only remaining memory of one who got a bit too close to the claw, rattling through every so often. Adrian then found something. A point of contention within the pistons of the door. Though the whole thing was locked up and had many fail-safes, he realized that there was a miscalculation in the schematics, which meant that if this one specific piston was compromised, it'd send the door on an automatic sequence to open. It was the only thing that made sense in the otherwise tight plans of an era gone. However, there was one downside to this discovery. The only way to fix it was from the inside. Now, getting in wasn't the problem. Many human-sized crawl spaces were designed like an ant-hive for minor engineering access. When we used them, we never had to go much deeper than a bit past the surface, but we knew that they wound on into a vast network. But when they were used to access the inner chamber long ago, it was nothing but an empty chamber, a luxury we in present time didn't have. In the silence between the thooming booms of the reverberating metal, we silently looked at each other, our eyes wordlessly discussing the fact that one of us had to go in. Many of us had families, friends, a life we wanted to live. This wasn't like a video game where after a noble sacrifice we could smugly sit back, knowing in our head we made the right choice. This was real life. To actually be faced with one's mortality throws all noble ideas from one's mind in favour of an innate sense of self-preservation. I want to emphasise this because what Adrian offered to do was beyond what I felt was humanly possible to undertake in that moment. He spoke up that he was most familiar with what needed to be done since it was him who found the flaw, and that he'd be in and out before we knew it. But who was he kidding? We were all as qualified as him, and we all knew that we could have done it with our eyes closed. Though it was transparent, he was trying to downplay things, even to himself. Knowing it was our only option at that point, we all went along and gave him our best. Now, the race was on. We wrenched open a small crawl chute a ways down from the entrance. Though it was further away from where the work was needed on first glance, it was the fastest way to a connecting tunnel to the inside. However, it would still take him a while before he'd even get into the inner chamber. All the while, the door was still opening at its daunting pace, and one glance at the shredded corpses showed that time was not on our side. A monstrous hand was now coming through. All we could do was watch while whatever wanted out fought tooth and nail, clawing giblets through the ajar door piece by piece every so often. Though the thick metal walls would cut out the frequency, Adrian's radio came through with updates on his whereabouts. Occasionally, he'd ask for minor directions to navigate the labyrinth of crawl spaces. It was imperative that he make it through ASAP, so we had shreds of paper all around us with maps upon maps of the circuitry and pipes. I, however, was somewhere else. I sat at the main console with one job. If things got dire, I was to hit one button to send out a warning to all nearby residents that a threat was imminent. a second option to tell them to evacuate immediately. I trusted my fellow engineers to translate the schematics to Adrian, and I was left with the daunting task of determining failure past the point of no return. I felt like a captain ready to go down with the ship, because by the time I'd be ready to hit the second button, it would be far too late to escape. Not like we had that luxury in the first place. Through the chatter from the radio I was left with, I could hear Adrian was only a few turns away from the main chamber. The team were hopeful and cheering him on as he got closer. I didn't have the heart to tell them that in front of me, I saw an entire arm reaching through, sweeping around for anything he could get his disgusting hand on. Whatever it was in there, it was huge. It was reaching out to what I can only presume was its shoulder, and it was reaching into the open working area outside of its confinement in long, many-meter bursts. It could easily grab a team of adults in one hand. Its nails were sharp in an unclean way. It looked like whatever it had for fingernails were long since shattered, probably from years of escape attempts, but that left them in shreds of serrated edges. In some ways, I'd have preferred they were the long claws they looked like they once were. At least a slice from it would have been clean. Whilst the arm was still scrambling around erratically in the main hall, Adrian made it through and had to drop to near radio silence lest he alert the scrambling behemoth. The silent moments were more tense than during Adrian's journey, as the silence made us fill in the gaps in logic we were trying our hardest not to think about. We were ecstatic to hear a faint voice from the other end. Adrian confirmed he had made it to the piston. As he theorized, it was in fact damaged, and he set about fixing it as fast and best he could. At the same time, the arm retracted, and much to my shock, not 2, but 4 hands grabbed each side of the still opening door, and with an ungodly strength, it tried its darndest to pry the gap further. Whatever those 70s scientists were smoking when they came up with the insane contraption before us, I want some, because despite its best efforts, the door didn't budge further than its slow, consistent opening speed. But it was all placebo for the creature, as not only was an arm threatening to poke through, it was wide enough that its gaunt torso was starting to squeeze through. And what we saw was more than we bargained for. A head and half of its upper body squeezed through. Anyone who was complacent with the arm's length were taken by surprise from its insanely long reach. The only thing constricting its escape was its bony pelvis. However, it didn't care, as it snatched up any bystander not quick enough to escape with its 4 wildly swinging arms and gobbled them down with ravenous speed. Screams rang out, and all hands in the main hall were in full route out of the chamber. We were at a level where I had to make a call that I wished wasn't true, that there was a chance we were going to fail. I hit the first failsafe. A message rang out to all phones in a 10-kilometer radius, warning residents that something was going down at the plant. Some people in the facility checked their phones, and the mood of the entire place plummeted as the daunting realization kicked in that this might be it. But we still had one hope left: Adrian. However, we watched as his time ran out. The creature scrambled back in with haste, an opposing action to everything we had witnessed beforehand. We didn't have long to theorize before we came to the settled conclusion that the only factor was Adrian. He was in the middle of radioing through an update before a sickening sound rang through the radio set. Then, silence. The silence was more than we were used to. At this point, silence meant a lack of spoken words between the resounding thooms of the creature. However, all noise had ceased. Not wanting to become complacent, we waited in hope, all while the door still slowly slid open. We very quickly realized we still needed to deal with that, so a small team was sent in through the door to reach the point where Adrian had been working. all that remained of him were 2 arms, one still holding onto the last tool he was working with, the other cast next to his radio. The small team very quickly finished the job and got out before the door closed. We were all left in a solemn time of peace to process what had happened. We grieved in a short period before knowing our priority of getting back to work. Engineers finished the patching up process, scientists went back to managing the plant's power output, cleanup crews were set about viscera cleanup, and I sat at the console with one last message to send out, that the previous message was nothing but a mistake. A beautiful lie to keep peace. We went on the best we could with what remained of the team. We later picked up a large batch of recruits. Like me, there were a heap of overqualified workers for the positions advertised that very quickly settled into doing top-notch work. However, mixed in were a batch of duds. People that got the deal of a lifetime. Insane pay for work they were woefully unprepared and underqualified for. A common factor was that they had no family to go back to. Working wanderers that didn't fit into the motif of the company. It wasn't hard to piece together why. They are soon to go into the center chamber for some, quote, hands-on experience. Afterwards, we qualified professionals are to follow to, quote, grade their work. They're very chipper about the experience and are excited for the opportunity. But we know the truth. Adrian's sacrifice had an unintended effect. The higher-ups now know that fresh meat could satiate whatever was inside, more than long enough for us to get some major work done. There's plans to fix the 2 broken-in walls, plus some plans for modernizations. The fresh recruits haven't gone in yet, and we're already interviewing new hires. More meat for the meat grinder. But it has to be done. For the greater good of the Canadian people, and maybe even the world. My buddy lives on a ranch about 20 miles outside the closest town. The family has a few crops on the property, walled off corn, soybeans, that kind of stuff. But they mainly herd livestock. Allegedly, business is good, and has always been good. But recently, they ran into a major problem. 2 weeks ago, they found a cow in the field with its entrails ripped out of its stomach. Last week, they found 3. Jeff called the police department and filed a report. He went through all the necessary paperwork with his insurance company to report the loss. It might sound heartless to a lot of people, and perhaps rightfully so, but at a certain point, farm animals become no more than property in the eyes of government and insurance scumbags alike. The cops decided the loss seemed sufficient enough to make a makeshift search in the woods around the family home. They sent in 2 guys with Dunkin' Donut cups. One decided it was probably a wolf, and the other insisted coyote, but both seemed convinced of the fact that the animal had moved on. The officers cited a lack of scat and track evidence and went on their merry little way. But Jeff insisted the animal was still out there. So he called me. Mind you, I'm not an animal expert. I don't know the first thing about cows, or farming, or ranching. I really didn't see how I could be of any use to anybody, and I told Jeff as much. But he sounded desperate. "You can fire a gun," he huffed over the phone. "Can't you?" "Barely," I told him. "It's been a while." "You have eyes," he continued, "right?" "Barely." "Good enough for me." I hesitated. He noticed. "You probably won't even have to use it," he continued hurriedly. "The gun, I mean. I just want to catch this thing in the act. If you help me with this thing in the field, if you help me watch the fields, we'll catch it, and then you'll be $200 richer. Win-win. I hesitated. He laughed. Come on, please, he begged. Plenty of beer in it for you too. Should have led with that. Dead cows didn't do it for you. We went back to joking about college and all our old memories. I liked Jeff. I was never the type of guy to keep up with more than a few close friends from college. I always thought my annoying recluse tendencies ticked off the rest, but Jeff and I stayed in touch. My wife was close to his girlfriend. My family was close to his. Part of me felt like I owed it to him to lend a hand. The other part realised I had nothing other than Netflix and junk food planned for the weekend. And so I got in my car and hit the road an hour later. With the window down, radio blaring and sunset fading, it felt like the right decision. I grew up a city boy. After college, I moved onto a prototypical city boy's life. I took a job at a big bank and toured my days away at a keyboard. I went home to a dark apartment building and woke up when it was just getting light. The point is that I rarely took the time to enjoy the awe-inspiring ability of nature. The drive to the farm was beautiful. An utter and serene feeling of immeasurable peace drifted out over the lonely country roads. The stars twinkled and vibrated up above. A warm rain came in over the mountain, and I left the windows down, just because it felt welcoming. I arrived at the farm a little after midnight. A long and winding driveway led to a paint-chipped barn and a house further down the way. Jeff stopped me in the road. He looked good, considering the circumstances, with a fresh new beard, overalls, and a thinning waistline. Farm life seemed to agree with him. He held a beer, a rifle, and an awfully uncomfortable-looking picnic chair. My car rolled because he beckoned me to drop the window. "My dad's asleep," he whispered into my window. "I've got a 12er set up by the field." I nodded and moved to park my obnoxiously red Honda. Jeff laughed at me. I'll admit it looked out of place, but I really don't know what he expected me to do about it. "Behind the barn," he pointed helpfully. "Don't want the big bad wolf to see you." I hit the emergency brake in a particularly appealing spot of mud and cowpat. When I got out, I stepped in it and smeared my pants nearly up to the knee. Jeff covered his mouth to keep from howling like an idiot. He gestured over his head and turned tail towards the field. I groaned and followed him miserably up and over the hill, dripping the whole way. The sky opened up like a snow globe the moment we hit the top of the hill. I had to stand there and just marvel at it for a bit. Acres and acres of open grassland reached deep into the forest's edge. A sea of white moved and stirred lazily. It took me a moment to realize that those were the cows. There had to be a dozen of them, sitting on the ground, minding their own business, while fat raindrops smacked their unsuspecting heads. We kept going down the hill until we found a lonely picnic chair surrounded by cigarette butts, pushed up against an old oak tree. A case of Miller Lite sat at the ready. I sat at my chair beside it and helped myself to the beer. "What do you think did it?" I asked with an even slurp. "Bears don't eat farm animals, do they?" Jeff shook his head and pulled up his chair. He pulled out the smokes. One of the bigger female cows snored loudly. We both got a kick out of that. "Nope," he murmured. "Wasn't a bear." I nodded while he blew a cloud of heavenly nicotine my way. "A wolf then?" I asked. "Has to be, I guess. Not that I would bloody know." "Could be a wolf." "Coyote?" "No," he muttered. "Too small." "What did you do with the bodies?" He looked at me for a minute. I could tell he was judging my capability. I didn't want to fail the test. Call that a stupid masculine thing. "Chum." "Come again?" "I used the bodies for chum." I stared blankly back. To attract the thing. he said through pursed lips and a cigarette. You know, like bait. Where? Turn around, he smiled. By the barn. I turned, and soon after fought the urge to vomit. Pushed up against the barn were 3 gallows-like structures. 3 rapidly decaying cows hung from long meat hooks. All of the animals' eyes were open. Decay, rot, and insects ate away at what remained of them. Bits of bones and guts stuck out from underneath ripped black and white covering. I felt my gag reflex, and I had to turn back just to keep from vomiting at the sight. Jesus, man, I groaned. Why? Sorry about that, Jeff chuckled. The smell will lure the animal. I swallowed the bile in my mouth. Maybe that made sense in some farmer linguistic I didn't understand. Maybe dead cows made great wolf bait. I salvaged the remainder of my dignity by grabbing another beer from the cooler, plopping back in my chair and changing the subject. So, how's Claudia? Jeff's eyebrows arched. He shifted in his chair awkwardly and pulled out another cigarette. It seemed like I hit a nerve. You didn't hear? He mumbled. Split up. No, that's awful. Afraid so. Mutual? Mostly. I nodded. I should have known the breakup, I thought. It was probably plastered all over Facebook. I should have been a better friend. I should have reached out and checked in. But I never did. Do you remember senior year? Jeff asked. Right before you graduated, you and Claudia went out on a date, right? Barely a date, I laughed. She needed someone to talk to. You guys had just broken up for the 100th time. I was telling her to take you back. He nodded and lit another cigarette. I always appreciated you doing that, he muttered. A true friend. Of course. And I appreciate you being here now. Of course. Not many people would have come out here in the middle of the night like this, he added, and you're really saving my ass. The free beer helped. Jeff laughed. I nodded, uncomfortably, unsure of where he was going with this. I gotta show you something, he murmured, about the wolf. He got up and spit out the cigarette. Then he tossed his empty beer into the field. Tendrils of smoke and dribble dripped down from his dark beard. He looked worried about something. Follow me. I stood and followed Jeff to the barn. The cows mooed their goodbyes just as a fresh wave of rain opened up over the valley. The barn had one of those old-fashioned padlocks with a single key entry. Jeff dug into his pockets for a moment, trying to find it. I took my time waiting in the night. When you and Claudia went on that date, Jeff muttered, still looking for his keys. Did you screw her? I stared at him blankly. Jeff was one of my closest friends. The fact that he had to even ask me that question made me feel ashamed. And the worst part of all was that he wouldn't look at me. My only close friend in the world, and he wouldn't even look at me. No. Are you sure? What the hell, man? Of course I'm sure. She's been texting a Matt, he murmured. I saw her phone. The world's full of Matts, I snapped. Wasn't me. Okay, I'm sorry. He laughed back with his hands up. Had to ask. Jeff nodded and fumbled a bit more with the keys. Finally, he found the one he was looking for and pushed it into the lock. The old barn door creaked unevenly. I stepped through it and into the darkness. Jeff called out behind me. Hey, he shouted. Do you know the best part about sheep? No. I looked up into the barn to find 3 human beings hung up on meat hooks. Their stomachs were gored and gutted. Their entrails dripped down like sausage links. All of them were dead. At least, I prayed they were dead, because no person should be left alive that way. Their eyes were rotted in the same way the animals up front. Their skin sagged like old rotting leather left out in the sun. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, but something heavy smacked against my head, and I don't remember much else after that. I woke up to the flashing lights of an ambulance. The story came to me in bits and pieces. Some of it is still foggy. I was lucky, I know that much. A neighbour reported a suspicious red Honda entering the farm around midnight. With the recent animal deaths and police visits, my car seemed more than a little suspicious. The neighbour also called Jeff's father 3 times that day. They had lunch plans a week ago, and the old man never showed. Those lunch plans might have saved my life. The cops arrived to find me with a meat hook in the fatty part of my thigh. They found Jeff with a bullet in his brainstem. The 3 victims in the rafters were his father, his wife, and an unidentified male. The detectives think he used the cows as an excuse to lure all of them into the barn. The final victim, Claudia, mercifully passed away shortly before I arrived. That could have been me. That should have been me. Do you know the best thing about sheep? They're oh so easy to lead. I grew up on a large plot of land my parents owned. They used to be scientists, biogenetic researchers to be precise, but gave up their careers for a simpler life. My parents' property is about 150 acres with a cattle farm and dense woods that I used to enjoy exploring. There was a large pond in the centre of the property's woods that I wasn't even aware of until I stumbled upon it by accident. When I brought it up to my parents, they angrily forbade me from ever going near the pond. My parents seldom got mad, but were no nonsense when they did, so I heeded their warning. This didn't stop me from asking questions. "It's dangerous," my father said when I asked him one day. "That's where your brother drowned." My older brother, Daryl, died when I was 3 years old. I was previously told he drowned, but didn't know it happened on our own property. My parents have a lot of pictures of Daryl. He's easy to identify most of them because of the army action figure he always had, which was his favourite toy. "He took it everywhere with him," my mother said the one time I brought it up while going through a family album. "He was so attached to that toy. We got it for him one Christmas when he was 5 years old." That was all she could say before getting choked up, after which I changed the subject. I seldom brought him up afterwards because I hated seeing my mother upset. Although I was still relatively young, when putting everything in perspective, I couldn't fathom what it must have been like for a parent to lose a child, nor the pain it caused my parents. My curiosity about the pond intensified when I learned my father, who I would periodically catch taking cattle into the woods, was drowning them in the pond. My mother said it was a necessary part of farm life, but assured me that he did it humanely and only to the old, sick, or dying animals. She also mentioned the pond had a population of large catfish that fed on the carcasses, which my father planned on harvesting. Despite their reasoning, I speculated my father's practice of drowning cattle was a mean of coping with my brother's death. I never brought this up, however, since I knew people coped with tragedy differently, even if it only made sense to them, and didn't want to upset my parents. I ultimately accepted my parents' rule about the pond, the tragic event that occurred there, what it was presently being used for, and moved on with my life. That all changed one night when I was 15 years old. My parents were vacationing and I had the house to myself. It was their second night away and I was settling in to watch a movie in the living room when I heard a knock at the glass sliding door. I turned to see my friend Aaron standing outside, who held a case of beer that he slowly lifted and started playfully shaking with a goofy grin across his face. Smirking, I walked over and opened the door. "Did any of the neighbours see you?" I asked as Aaron quickly scampered inside, setting the beer on the kitchen table. "What neighbours?" Aaron asked jokingly as he set out 2 beers and put the case in the refrigerator. "Your closest one is literally down the block." "They still could have seen you walk by," I replied conscientiously. "They know my parents are away and have been checking in on me." Aaron chuckled as he tossed me a beer. "We're fine. I didn't even pass a single car when I walked over." Being a typical teenager, I still dabbled with drinking and other recreational substances, but was considered the paranoid one among my friends. I knew Aaron for a long time, and we've gotten in trouble before, but that didn't stop us from indulging when the opportunity was present. My parents weren't the biggest fans of Aaron for this reason, and specifically prohibited him from coming over when they were gone. We were teenagers, of course, so it didn't stop us from doing it anyway, which I think my parents knew and were letting slide as long as there weren't any damaging ramifications. We spent the night drinking beers, watching movies and playing video games. Aaron managed to swipe a few cigarettes from his parents' pack, which we smoked outside, making sure to have ample time in between each one so they would last the night. We were on our final cigarette around 1 in the morning and finished every single beer, so we were steadily drunk. We were about halfway done with a cigarette, which we shared, when Aaron made a bold and daring proposition. "Are you still not allowed near the pond?" Aaron asked, gesturing towards the pond's direction with his head. "I don't even think I will be when I'm a grown-ass man," I replied after taking a drag from the cigarette. "It's just something I've accepted at this point. No use in dwelling." A smirk formed over Aaron's face as he slowly turned to face me. "What's stopping us from going there right now?" he asked compellingly. I didn't say anything and took a lengthy drag, causing me to cough upon exhaling. "I promised I won't go near it. Plus my dad dumps cattle in there to feed the catfish. He probably doesn't want anyone messing around there because of that." "Have you ever seen one?" Aaron asked, finishing the cigarette and flicking it into some bushes. "It's a long-term project," I replied. "He's growing them for 10-15 years before they're harvested. Apparently, they're worth a lot of money when they reach a certain size and weight." "We should fish it," Aaron said shyly, "since the night is the best time for catfishing." I didn't say anything at first and stared at the ground, kicking an invisible pebble. "What's stopping us, and who will know?" Aaron asked encouragingly, nudging me with his shoulder. "What your parents don't know won't hurt them." It took a few minutes of convincing, but I eventually caved and agreed to take him to the pond. After disposing of the empty beer cans, we grabbed 2 fishing rods, my tackle box, a flashlight, and hot dogs for bait. I was admittedly nervous about going to the pond, more so because it would be my first time seeing it up close, and did feel some guilt about breaking what seemed like my parents' most important rule. During the walk, I did put the whole situation in perspective and concluded my parents' reasoning was emotionally motivated. There was nothing dangerous about what we were doing, and I ironically swam for my school, so drowning was the least of my worries. Upon arrival, we were greeted by a fence comprised of wooden posts and barbed wire that encircled the pond. I didn't remember a fence the last time I cast my eyes on the pond, which my father must have built fairly recently. "I guess your dad's really serious about keeping anyone from going near it," Aaron commented as we started looking for a way to surmount the fence. After a few minutes, we discovered a section where a tree had fallen onto the fence, giving us easy access. Upon crossing, a feeling of knotty anticipation formed in my stomach as I approached the shoreline and shined the light onto the pond's calm, inky black surface. The water was completely placid, like it was frozen in time. The pond had somewhat of an oval shape, with patches of brush and reeds scattered along the shoreline. We spotted a rectangular platform on the water, where we set up shop and started stringing our poles. After briefly arguing about bobbers or having our bait sink to the bottom, Aaron used a bobber, while I went with the latter method. After a half hour of no action, we recast in different areas, but quickly grew bored and started debating over whether we casted far enough and if hot dogs were adequate bait. In the midst of our discussion, my cell phone started ringing, and that knotty queasiness in my stomach returned when I saw my father was calling. Aaron and I both exchanged panic looks before I gestured for him to be quiet and hurried off the dock before answering. "Is everything okay?" I asked quickly, becoming increasingly nervous for why my father would be calling this late. All I heard were the muffled gargled sounds of a crowd, along with unrhythmic tapping and scraping sounds. I could just make out my parents' voice in the background, who sounded like they were conversing and laughing. After calling out for my dad a few more times and getting no response, I realized what was happening and giggled. "Pocket dial," I whispered to myself after exhaling deeply and flipping my phone shut. I chuckled as I returned to the dock, where Aaron stood nervously. "He pocket dialed me," I replied, rubbing my stomach to try curb my growing queasiness. Aaron released a lengthy sigh of relief as he started reeling in his line back, despite casting moments earlier. "I think I'm going to follow your lead and let my bait sink to the bottom," Aaron said as he motioned for the tackle box, which I slid over towards him with my foot. I looked down at my pole, whose line was straightened, but showed no signs of movement. "Just don't cast in the same place as me," I replied, pointing in the direction where I cast my line. "You okay?" Aaron asked with a half smile across his face. "You look like you're about to puke." I was trying to ignore my intensifying nausea, but reached the point where I'd coat the dock with my vomit if I so much as opened my mouth. Tightly pursing my lips, I nodded affirmingly to Aaron, who started laughing as I sprinted off the platform, stopped about 15 or 20 feet away, and violently regurgitated my stomach contents. It took about a minute or two before I was certain everything was expunged from my system. After some additional spitting and deep breathing, the queasiness was finally gone. I admittedly was a bit of a lightweight with drinking, and in addition to being the paranoid one, was also reputed as the puker when we parted. I exhaled deeply after wiping my mouth, knowing Aaron would probably antagonize me for this and not shy away from relaying this story to our friends. All I could hope for now was one of us hooking onto a lunker catfish, so my little episode wasn't the highlight of tonight's outing. Upon returning to the dock, however, I quickly realized something was amiss. Aaron was gone. His fishing pole was still on the dock, but Aaron was nowhere to be seen. I called out his name and picked up the flashlight to conduct a 360-degree survey of my surroundings. At first, I thought he went to take a pee, but grew extremely uneasy when he wasn't responding. "Don't be screwing around right now, dude. You know this isn't the place." The fact that I was still a little drunk didn't make matters easier. My first thought was, what if he had fallen into the water and hit his head in the process? I quickly started shining the flashlight over the water's surface, whose beam of light barely penetrated its black depths. While scanning the water of the platform's edge, I paused upon reaching Aaron's pole and focused the light on the dock's edge. There was what looked like a smeary handprint comprised of a black, sludgy substance about the size of a dinner plate. Canting my head, I was about to squat down and inspect it closer when the sounds of rustling and a squishy crunching rang out from behind me. Pointing the flashlight toward where the sounds came from, I spotted a cluster of reeds along the shoreline rustle for a good second or two. In my waning drunken state, I figured Aaron was up to something and went to investigate. In case Aaron was trying to pull some sort of intricate scare prank, I turned off my flashlight and quietly crept up to the reeds. I picked up sounds of that same squishy crunching and something shifting upon growing closer. Hoping to beat Aaron at his own game, I quickly flicked the flashlight on, parted the row of reeds, and quickly shined the flashlight into the small opening at the center of the cluster. I saw Aaron lying on the ground, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky, limbs unnaturally twisted in different directions. There was something looming over him about 5 or 6 feet in length, resembling a large fish with a pointed finless tail. The creature had dark, purplish grey skin with a coarse slimy texture and 2 dorsal fins. I thought it was some kind of giant catfish at first, but the upper part of its torso was elevated off the ground like a snake. It was then I noticed Aaron's body was covered in the same black slime as the handprint, and he had a gaping cavity that ran down his chest and abdomen. The black ooze dripped from 2 dark purple slender limbs protruding from a mouth-like opening on top of the creature's torso, whose clawed appendages were ripping pieces of Aaron's flesh, innards, and feeding them into the same opening from which they extended. The creature turned towards me a few seconds after shining my light on it, revealing its greyish white underbelly. Unable to move, my widened, terror-filled eyes made out the vague impressions of human facial features. 2 eyes, a nose, a slit-like mouth, embedded on the creature's elevated upper torso. The opening from which the 2 arms and limbs extended was roughly the length of a baseball bat, whose interior was lined with rows of thorn-shaped teeth. A few seconds of tense silence passed before the creature emitted what I can only describe as a cross between a low, deep, gargled buzz, before it charged towards me at an unexpectedly horrifying speed. Shrieking loudly, I sprinted the fastest I've ever run until I reached and scrambled over the down section of fence. Using my adrenaline-fueled instincts, I raced back to my house, not looking back until I burst into my house and locked the door. Panting and perspiring heavily, my head was spinning and my heart felt like it was beating through my chest. Struggling to process what just happened, I started to sob until a strong wave of nausea swept over me, after which I threw myself over the kitchen sink and started profusely vomiting. I don't remember much else afterwards, aside from sitting on the kitchen floor and staring out blankly until eventually falling asleep. I woke up to the sounds of pounding rain the next morning. Along with a splitting headache, I was still in a slight degree of shock. The rain ceased around noon, and for the sake of confirming everything I'd seen the night before, I reluctantly returned to the pond. The fishing poles and tackle box were still there, but the black sludgy handprint had been washed away by the rain. I checked the cluster of reeds where I discovered the creature and Aaron's body to see both were also gone. There weren't any traces of me or Aaron ever being at the pond that night, which felt both reassuring and unnerving. I spotted something I didn't notice the night before as I surveyed the pond. Animal bones and hides that were scattered along the shoreline. I pondered a morbid truth upon noticing this gruesome detail. Was my father using the cattle he brought here to feed this creature? It now made sense why my parents didn't allow me to go near the pond. There was no way I could tell them what happened, but it put me at ease knowing any signs of me and Aaron being there were washed away by the rain. Fortunately, It stormed again later that day to extinguish any footprints I might have made upon returning. Aaron always snuck out of his house, so nobody knew he came over that night. Although they noted I was being relatively distant, my parents didn't suspect anything when they returned. Aaron's parents reported him missing 2 days later. The police even came over to my house to question me about my friendship with him and if I knew where he could have gone. Despite the boiling guilt beneath my skin, I denied knowing anything about his potential whereabouts. Aaron was obviously never found, and his disappearance sparked a small wave of hysteria that a kidnapper might be prowling the area. About 10 days passed. It was a Saturday morning, and my parents left before I had awoken for a day trip. It was a little after 11 by the time I woke up, and something looked out of place when I scanned my room. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, causing me to get out of bed and take a closer look at my surroundings. My eyes stopped at my window when I realized what the anomaly was. My blood ran cold. There was a vague handprint on my bedroom window, which was on my house's first floor, comprised of a black slime-like substance. It's what was perched on the window's outside sill, covered in the same black oozy slime that sent a sharp chill down my spine. Although it succumbed greatly to the elements, it was clearly an army action figure, the same one my older brother had with him in all his photos. "Oh, he's everywhere," Carol said. "He's not just here." I looked up from my coffee and took a moment to listen to the nearby conversation. "Really?" Greg asked. "I thought he was just something people here made up." "No," she answered. "Mr. Tatler goes way, way back, and it just depends on where you are. So in fast food places, they say he lives in the deep fat fryer, but generally people say he lives somewhere high risk. So around here, he lives in the boxes and the high shelves. The story changes a lot, but the message is the same. Be careful, don't put your hand in broken machine parts, don't try cleaning the fryer without supervision, be careful what you take down from the shelves." "Oh, so it's like a safety thing?" "Yeah," Carol answered. "It's to discourage newbies from grabbing random boxes without looking at the labels. Do you know how many injuries we get because some idiot tries taking a set of weights down from the high shelf thinking it was a box full of blankets?" "I thought it was just a good way to prank new people," Greg mused. "Well, there's that too," Carol smirked. "Do you remember when Alec over there lost his watch?" Both faces turned to me. I think at this stage I was supposed to laugh, but I remembered the event vividly, and I didn't find it funny. It was just that the whole floor had roared at me with laughter, and it wasn't even the sense of total helplessness I felt when I realized my supervisor, who up until then had been completely supportive, was in on the joke. It was just that when I'd grabbed the watch and pulled up, something had caught my hand and it felt like someone was in there pulling me down. And for a brief moment in time, I believed in Mr. Tatler. And I believed he'd come for me and no one was going to help me. "Hilarious," I groaned. "Didn't they have to send you home for the day?" Greg asked, nearly choking with laughter. I thought back to the feeling of what had grabbed me. It was cold, but nothing like steel or plastic. It had felt wet, soft to the touch, but unnaturally strong. Images of rotting hands and cadaverous bones popped into my head. I really did think something was in there and was going to pull me in. Even worse, I'd seen it. For just a brief moment, I'd seen something down there, moving amongst all the dingy, forgotten machinery. "I can see him," Greg cried out laughing, imitating me on my first day. "I can see Mr. Tatler, he's got me." The two of them were beside themselves with laughter. "One for the ages," I grunted, before getting up and walking away from the lunchroom, I quickly left, leaving half my lunch uneaten. I'd been working in a supervisory position for years by that point, and hadn't been on the warehouse floor as a worker for a long time. I spend most of my days watching cameras and reporting people for misconduct. It's very 1984, and means I'm alone most of the time, and yet I still couldn't escape the humiliation I'd felt on my first day. By the time I settled at my workstation, a dark mood had come over me, and even as I tried to focus on my work, it lingered in unpleasant ways. For the first hour or so, nothing happened, and yet the shadows on the camera feed looked darker. The space around me felt emptier and lonelier than usual, and I found myself struggling to concentrate. I told myself it was just because I was tired, but I kept imagining that feeling of being grabbed on the first day. It was so bad, I'd even jumped when I first sat down. All I could do, though, was to keep scanning the monitors, and eventually I came across the unusual sight of a man standing perfectly still over an empty conveyor belt. How old was this guy? I wondered. In his 60s? Once again, the machines had failed and nothing had appeared. A quick search in the system showed that that guy was on the 13th hour of a 12-hour shift, and I realized that his mind must have been mush. He didn't even move in response to the broken machine. He just swayed a little. I reached out, getting ready to report him for disciplinary action, when the old man finally looked up. Like a drunk looking for the door, he shuffled around before walking off towards some shelving units nearby. There, he turned the corner and... Damn it, I groaned before cycling through every camera so that I could try find him again. But none of the monitors covered that space. It was just a tight corridor between two enormous ceiling-high shelves filled top to bottom with boxes of every shape and size. I figured he might have been smoking, or even going in for a nap, but without the cameras I couldn't see. I decided I'd just have to sit back and wait to see if he emerged. Except he never did. I kept checking back for the next few hours, but the space where he'd worked was always empty. Eventually, I called an amnesty worker and asked them to go check, but a few moments later they radioed back and told me there was nothing down there. I must have explained it to them another 100 times. They were wrong, I told them. There was no way for him to leave. He had to be down there. I checked the tapes. They showed him entering, but never leaving. I was told, politely but firmly, to go check for myself if I was so sure. So, that's what I did. I waited till the end of my shift and went down there. By that point in the day, things had started to die down a little. People arriving for night shift aren't exactly the chattiest of customers, and there's a solemn atmosphere that keeps everything kind of muted. In fact, I've always hated walking through the floor to get home at night. Everyone there feels damn close to offing themselves, and the way they look at me sends shivers down my spine. When I finally found the old man's workstation, I saw the empty space he'd stood over, and something about it seemed oddly uncanny. At the time, he'd been alone, and that whole corner of the warehouse was deserted when I arrived. I didn't like that one bit, and I wondered if I was going to force myself to stay for much longer. The warehouse is a building so big you can't even see the end of it. Rows and rows of thousands of shelves, all stacked to the very top with boxes and crates. I hate the feel of grit and dusty concrete beneath my shoes, and the buzzing fluorescence struggled to light the ground from so high up, turning into a gloomy place filled with gloomy people. It's a labyrinthian city of busy workers, half-broken robots, and endless darkened corners casting soft-edged shadows that hurt the eyes. Close by, I'd found the corner where he'd turned, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing that I could see. It was a dark alleyway between two shelving units with very little light. Images of the poor old man lying there, half dead from a heart attack, hidden by shadow, came into my mind, so I decided to take a closer look. As I took the first few steps into the claustrophobic corridor, the sound of distant work and machinery faded into the background. As I passed gaps in the walls around me, shadows crossed my face and danced in thick bands. Without knowing why, my heart began to thunder. I hated feeling that scared, but I remembered the way everyone was laughing at lunch, the way they'd laughed on my first day, and I forced myself to keep going. There was nothing to fear, I told myself, over and over. Eventually, I reached the very end and saw that the shelves were pushed against the wall with no easy way to squirrel through. Either the old man had disappeared into thin air, or he'd climbed out, or tunneled out, or God knows what. Whatever the explanation was, I decided I could think about it elsewhere. I turned, getting ready to go home, when I saw a box standing alone in the middle of the floor, between me and the exit. I jumped at the sight of it. I had been alone the whole time, and it hadn't been there when I'd first come down. There hadn't been so much as a whisper, and yet, there it was. A box as big as a fridge, something I couldn't have missed. I approached it and tried to push, but the damn thing was too heavy for one person. I had to squeeze past, force myself to lean my entire weight against it just to get enough room to go past. The smell of it was awful, like a mixture of ammonia and sewage, and it reached so far up into my nose I felt the hair on my neck stand on end. Thankfully, I found someone close by to help me go back and sort it out. You can't leave obstructions on the floor, no matter where, because of how much the warehouse relies on robots for cleaning. So together, this guy and I went back down the corridor, his face screwing up from the smell, and I told him to get ready for just how damn heavy this thing was. Except he reached out and effortlessly moved it along the ground, the empty cardboard inching easily against the gritty floor. He briefly looked at me like I was an idiot. "It's empty." "I know," I snapped before reaching up and opening the top flap. "But it wasn't before." I grimaced when I pulled my hand back. Something greasy and orange, the colour of used cooking oil, was left on my fingers from handling the lid. With room to air, the smell within the box multiplied 1,000 times and hit us both like a brick. The guy beside me started to retch, and it took me a good few minutes to even be able to look inside. When I did, I saw a nest of shredded, half-chewed gunk, looking a bit like a wasp's nest, or maybe even the kind of thing a hamster might make. It was big though, bigger than your typical dog breed, and large parts of the pulp had been soaked in rusty brown fluid that smelled like copper, since dried to a flaky crust. And there were scratches all around the side of the box, long horizontal ones, but all irregular in length and size. It took all our willpower to handle the thing and clean it up without being sick, and for a few days afterwards, there were rumours of someone squatting in the warehouse, which I know for sure didn't come from me. After that, I started having trouble sleeping at home. I figured it was my experience in the warehouse, and that I'd be fine if I stuck to my own station. But it wasn't exactly like I was staying up in the Ritz either. My workstation was small, claustrophobic, and deeply depressing. Every time I reported someone for taking too long a break or for slipping something unseen into their pockets, I was reminded of that old man. I checked, and he never came back to work, being marked down as leaving without notice. I've been told people quit the warehouse without telling anyone all the time, but I kept thinking about that box and the strange weight I'd felt trying to push my way past it. I kept wishing that the thought of what was in it would stop bothering me, but it never left. And without realizing why, I found myself Googling Mr. Tatler. Over time, I found versions of him for just about every type of retail worker out there. In almost every story, he was something hidden in a return package, sent back to a store to spite workers. But his overall vibe seemed to change from vengeful trickster to malevolent god depending on who was telling. The closest I got to a physical description was when someone called him a growth rather than a thing, although it never exactly said what that growth was. It just resonated with me for some reason, making me think of an old story I read about a girl who never stopped growing and eventually destroys the world. And of course, everyone mentioned how he either lived in or was drawn to broken things. People can be broken too, I thought, when it finally came time to leave. I'd spent all day watching people like some kind of gargoyle in the rafters, reporting old women for taking too long to get a box off a shelf, seeing people cry in hidden corners while I radioed their boss to give them a row, watching while friends supported each other while I timed them to make sure they didn't take too long to hug a sobbing co-worker. By the time I was walking back through the floor to get to the parking lot, I was thoroughly depressed and just wanted to get back home to sleep. I'd rather be back working in the drive-thru, I thought. No Mr. Tatler there. "Are you broken?" someone said, their raspy voice waking me from my trance. I'd been sulking around with my head hung low and my hands stuffed in my pockets. When I turned, I saw a young man standing at a station, eyes fixed on an empty spot. Nearby, I could hear some gear clicking loudly in protest as something had broken down. A brief second passed, and I realized he was talking to the machine, not me. I nearly laughed at my mistake, except he spoke again. "Are you broken, Alec?" he said, before looking at me with bloodshot eyes. "Mr. Tatler lives in broken things. Does he live in you?" His head turned to the side. "Are you a broken thing?" "What?" I stammered. The young man heard me and began to blink. Slowly, he looked around and rolled his shoulders, stretching them. "Ah, Christ," he said. "The thing's bust." Then, as if seeing me for the first time, he asked, "How long have you been there? You aren't going to report me, are you? It's not my fault it broke." "No," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I'm leaving." I carried on, trying my hardest to keep my eyes on the floor, even as I passed row after row of shelves, their strange shadows doing everything to catch my eye. "It's not far," I told myself. "Not far, and then I'm out." "Are you broken?" someone asked. I jumped and saw a dead-eyed woman glaring at me from a row of shelves. "Alec, are you broken?" She slipped backwards, and it was like she dissolved into the inky blackness. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone. Close by I could hear steps, but were they hers? I stepped forward and fumbled around looking for my phone torch. After a few seconds I turned it on and revealed nothing but a set of aluminium shelves filled with junk and nothing to note. I went to leave, but was stopped by the sight of a large box sitting plainly in the middle of the floor, lit for all to see by the glaring overhead lights. Not far, I reminded myself. The way out is just around the corner. I just need to get past the box. I took a step, and the box moved. A flap near the top quivered, and that familiar smell flooded the air. I would have retched, but I was paralyzed with fear. "Are you broken?" asked the voice, this time wretched and ragged and desperate. Suddenly, the box fell over, and a repulsive stew of blooded brown oil flooded the floor, foaming as it mixed with dust and debris from a long day's work. I stepped back, but could not stop it breaking against the soles of my shoes. Up ahead lay the overturned box, damp and sagging from its contents. "Mr. Tatler lives in broken things," said the voice again, and a hand reached out of the darkness within, striking the wet concrete with a loud splat. "Mr. Tatler," it cried, the enunciation increasingly distorted. Out of the box slid a naked body, the back glistening with effluent and boils. The skin was raw and pink, like the peeling flesh of a burn victim. In agony, they tried to stand up, but kept slipping and flailing in the slick afterbirth from their nest. They looked like a newborn fawn trying to stand. Looking closer, I realized in horror what was wrong. They were like a half-digested meal. One hand wrapped around their stomach, where I glanced at innards held inside like stuffing of a teddy bear, and around their jaw and collar muscle, the skin had thinned down to sheer bone, which jutted out from their body like a knife tearing through rubber. "Are you broken?" he asked, looking at me with just one milky eye bulging loosely from the socket. He tried to stand once more, but fell in the oil, and I winced at the way his soft bones crumpled from the impact. He was sobbing now, but when he looked up, I had a flash of recognition that turned my stomach. It was the old man I'd watched disappear. "Are you broken?" he pleaded with me, desperation in his voice. "Please," he screamed as I turned and ran, terror flooding me at the sound of his manic attempts to follow me. "Please, are you broken? Are you broken? Are you broken? Are you broken?" I fled, the sound of his voice growing distant. The last thing I heard from him was a sad, resigned admission carried to me on the air as a pathetic whine. Because I was. And with that, there was a loud thunk, a sound that brought sudden darkness and far-off cries and confusion. In an instant, the light had gone out, and I stopped still. Some light still filtered through as the odd person used their torches to look around. But all I could see was the disorienting array of shadows and blinding lights too far away to help. Up close, there was nothing but blackness and the sound of my own heart. I couldn't even see my own hands. I turned on my phone light, but could see only a small patch of concrete around me, and the vague sense of nearby shelves and an overhead roof that were little more than blobs in the darkness. I didn't know how far I'd ran. I could see nothing of the box, and yet that foul smell still lingered in the air. I was tempted to find it, since the exit was so close by. But the croaking voice of that monstrous, half-eaten thing had left me shaking and barely able to think clearly. Instead, I rushed further into the warehouse, hoping to reach one of the people with torches who could be glimpsed, half seen, through gaps in the shelves. But what followed was like a kind of nightmare. I was utterly lost, unable to see further than a meter or two ahead, like the very darkness itself was being woven around me. Every time I thought I was close, I'd find myself chasing reflections, or the way ahead of me would be blocked by unpassable machines. "Help me!" I cried out to one man I spotted behind some shelves. "Just go around," he replied, gesturing to my right. "It's not far." But when I followed his directions, there was nothing there, and when I looked back, not a second later, he was gone. Only his torch remained, sitting on the ground. I started to panic, and the temptation to crawl into a hole and cry was getting harder to ignore. People were close by, I knew it, but every time I felt like I was getting closer, I'd find myself wandering down dead ends or turning back onto myself. And then, just when I felt like I was getting close enough to reach the busiest part of the warehouse, the sound of hysterical cries filled the air. All around in the darkness, people started shouting, asking questions. "Who's that? Stay there. Don't move. What happened? Was it a machine? An accident? Was someone scared of the dark? Had someone fallen? Keep calm. Someone call the police." all these and more filled the air like distant music. I tried crying out, but it was like the dark was eating my cries. My voice faded to nothing as the clamour grew louder, and if anyone cried out back to me, I couldn't hear. In desperation, I found a wall and slid down against it. Not long after, a terrifying scream of pain rang out from the darkness, and soon there was another. At that point, I couldn't say if it was hysteria or not, but I felt the panic rise. I could hear people running, shouting, yelling. The whole place turned into total mania while I pressed my hands as hard as I could against my ears and tried to block it all out. I screwed my eyes shut when, somehow, I heard the sound of bare feet slapping on concrete. Frantically, I held up my light but saw nothing except for roaming shadows and plain boxes. Panning the light around, I glimpsed half-open crates and abyssal shadows within them, the strange darkness twisting and dancing. Only the broken see him. Damn, I cried, waving my phone around desperately, glimpsing a pale face in one of the boxes as I swung around, only to swing back a second later and see a crumpled duvet in the packaging. Another footstep. Who likes to be seen? The words were whispered as if from above, and I ran without a moment's thought. It wasn't just the sound, it was the tickling breath on the crown of my head. I wasn't even near a wall or any shelves, and the rafters were easily 30 feet above me. Can you see him? It whispered again, the hair on my head caressed by the rancid breath. What the hell is happening? I wailed, close to a total breakdown. Lights are back on, someone cried. One by one, the lights came back with powerful kathunks until at last, the one closest to me came on and I was surrounded by light. There was nothing nearby except some boxes, a large conveyor belt, and on the wall opposite me, a blinking camera looking down. Looking at it, something in my head fell into place, like the final piece of a puzzle. There was only one place my cameras couldn't see. I looked up. Behind the lights, hanging low on the wire, was an oblique darkness. I could see structural support beams that held up the enormous roof, the occasional slanted window, completely dark at this time of night in winter, and thousands of wires, pipes and tubes that carried air, water and light to the whole enormous warehouse. And I saw Mr. Tatler, much the same as I'd seen him that first day, hiding up there when no one even bothers to look. He looked straight back at me, and for a moment I thought he might take me. In one hand he held that half-eaten man, stroking his glistening bald head like a cat stroking a kitten, before putting him away like a handkerchief. His head tilted, if only for a moment, and I fell backwards onto my ass. The sight of him, it was like a painting made of cancer. I couldn't think, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't dare come close to describing him. He was huge. Once, when I was a kid, my dad told me that all us humans are really clinging to the roof of a bottomless abyss, and the next night I looked up at the stars and it was so scary I couldn't stop crying. That feeling of insignificance was how I felt looking into Mr. Tatler, like he was bigger than I could even see or even think. They found me in a crate I'd pulled shut, sobbing. I don't remember it. The last thing I remembered was Mr. Tatler, and then a profound sense of darkness. It felt like a nightmare of being eaten alive or trapped floating in an alien ocean with nothing but the sense of something giant slithering past your feet. He lives in broken things, and so much around us is clearly broken. I see him everywhere now. He was always there. I just never noticed. It all began 2 years ago. I was driving home from the bar after a night out with friends. Everyone told me to catch an Uber, but I had driven my own car to the bar that night and I didn't want to leave it in the parking lot overnight. It wasn't the best area, and I was afraid it would get stolen or broken into. Those were my excuses, of course. If I had, the accident never would have happened, and I never would have damaged my sight or killed that innocent man. The accident happened on the highway as I drove home, far beyond the legal limit of intoxication. Although I was drunk, I recall the crash vividly. It has haunted my dreams every single night. There's a long stretch of forest between my house and the bar I was at that night. The roads are full of sharp curves and completely lacking any form of light. Not many people take those roads after midnight, fearing the likelihood of hitting a deer on one of the blind turns. It wasn't a deer I hit, however. It was a young man of 29, driving home from a double shift as a nurse, likely daydreaming of walking through his front door to give his 3-month-old baby a goodnight kiss and crawl into bed with his wife. I like to believe he didn't suffer. Our cars collided head-on as I veered into the oncoming lane inside one of the blind corners. He tried to steer away from me, but there wasn't enough time. I hit him at no less than 50 miles per hour, forcing his car off the edge of the steep hill we crashed on. He stood no chance at survival, while all I suffered was a concussion and a bruised collarbone. It wasn't fair. Me, a selfish drunk trying to keep my car from getting damaged, had been the direct cause of this loss of an innocent life. A father, a husband. I was rushed to a hospital as soon as the next passing car saw me in the middle of the road, airbags deployed, my blood covering the steering wheel. I was knocked unconscious, unaware at the time of the damage I'd caused. It wasn't until I awoke in the hospital several days later that I was able to inform someone about the other car. The poor man's family had to wait nearly a week to find out where he was, and only to find out that he had been killed by a goddamn drunk driver. It wasn't fair. Soon after awaking, I'd learned that the damage to my head had caused me to lose most of my sight. The doctors tried to explain what had happened, but I've never been known for my memory or my understanding of biology, so I'll spare you any attempts at trying to explain what they had told me. I served a 1-year sentence in prison for vehicular manslaughter while under the influence of alcohol. I deserved worse, I know. You don't need to tell me. Though if you do, I wouldn't blame you. Throughout most of my prison sentence, I had to make do with non-prescription glasses. I could hardly see through them, making my life quite difficult as an inmate. I was often the target of prison gangs, taking beatings every other week. They knew I could hardly see, and somehow they learned that I had killed a man and that he had a young daughter at home. I deserved every beating. Just a few weeks before my release, my requests for a doctor were finally approved. I needed real glasses, and getting healthcare in prison was not an easy thing to accomplish. It took longer than expected to be directed to an optometrist. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after I was released that I was finally able to see one. I had no health insurance, but I was lucky enough to find a doctor that offered to help me if I followed an easy payment plan. I felt lucky, and even though I didn't deserve it, I accepted the help. As I was called into the doctor's office, I was met by the optometrist that I'd previously spoken to. She was an exceptionally kind woman of about 50 years old. Before I could even introduce myself, she began to speak. "Hello, Mr. Jones," she said, looking down at my medical record. "I see here that you suffered a severe concussion during a car accident." I nodded, hoping she wouldn't ask any details about the accident. "Yes, that's correct, Doctor. You may call me Claire. I'd never like to go by my title. It always makes me feel like I've got some sort of god complex." "I see. Well, Claire, I greatly appreciate what you're doing for me. If it weren't for you, I'd be stuck with dollar store glasses forever." "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Jones. You'll be paying me just the same as anyone else, just a little slower. It's nothing, trust me." With that, Claire had me take a seat in the examination chair. She put me through the motions of the typical eye exam, testing how far I could see and the level of thickness I would need for my lenses. Overall, it was an easy experience. I was excited to finally be able to see again. A few days later, I received an email that my new glasses were ready for pickup at Claire's office. Without wasting a moment, I ordered an Uber to bring me there, as I was no longer able to drive. Not only was my license suspended, but my sight was far too damaged for driving. I arrived at the doctor's office, anxious to try the glasses and experience clear sight again for the first time in over a year. I couldn't believe it was finally going to happen. I had forgotten what it was like to really see. I got my glasses and immediately put them on. My vision became as clear as it had ever been. It was just as amazing as I'd expected, if not more so. I suddenly realized how I'd taken advantage of the privilege of sight. It's easy to forget how incredible it is when you have it your entire life. As I rode home in the backseat of another Uber, watching the trees as we passed by with a clarity I'd grown to miss so much, I began to feel an odd sort of headache coming on. It wasn't terrible, but it just sat behind both of my eyes. It was the type of headache you get from looking at screens for too long, only I never had it affect both eyes at once. I shrugged it off as a side effect of the new glasses and decided I'd just take some ibuprofen once I made it back home. By the time I arrived home, only 20 or so minutes later, the pain behind my eyes had increased to something far beyond anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if someone had taken my optic nerves and ripped them apart. The pain was so bad that my sight had nearly vanished, regardless of wearing my new glasses. I decided to take them off, hoping the pain would subside. Thankfully, the pain did fade after several hours without wearing the glasses. On top of that, I'd taken a couple extra painkillers in hopes that they would work faster and harder than usual. Once the pain was mostly gone, I felt it would be best to call Claire and ask for her advice. If anyone would have known whether the pain was normal, it would have been her. After describing the progression of the pain to her, she offered her best advice, explaining that, in some rare cases, people can have severe migraines as a reaction to the corrective lenses. On top of that, since I'd suffered a major head injury, that side effect could become even more likely. She suggested I try wearing the glasses in small increments to see if my eyes would adjust, and if it didn't help, we would try something new. So, over the next few days, I did what she recommended, and within just a 3-day period, I experienced more pain than I'd ever felt in all my time living thus far. If you've ever heard stories of the old days when folks had to remove their own teeth due to infections, you can imagine how much pain I was going through when I'd almost decided to remove my own damn eyeballs to stop the pain. On top of the pain, or maybe because of it, I began hallucinating during those few days. Over and over, I saw the dark roads of the night of my car accident. I saw the horrified face of the man I'd killed as he realized what was happening. There was nothing I could do but watch as the accident happened over and over again, right before my damaged eyes. I decided enough was enough. It was time to go see Claire. I was certain she would find a way to help me keep my sight and get rid of the agonizing torture I'd been through. During my second visit, she agreed that the glasses weren't going to be the right fit for me. She believed it was likely due to my concussion, and she felt she had a solution. She suggested a special type of contact lenses made for people who experienced migraines from glasses, and due to the horrible side effects I'd experienced, she wasn't going to charge me at all for the second visit or the contacts. I was willing to try anything at that point, and I was more than grateful for her generosity. I went home that night, excited yet again to finally be able to see, and even more so for getting rid of the headaches. As soon as I made it home, I rushed to the bathroom to try the contact lenses. Before putting them in, I followed the instructions Claire provided so as to not cause any discomfort. I washed my hands for several minutes, making sure to get rid of any trace of debris. Then I removed the first contact lens from its case and placed it into my palm. Next, I sprayed the lens with a cleaning solution Claire provided and prepared to place it into my eye. As I held my eyelids back, slightly trembling in anticipation, I placed the lens into my eye. It was much simpler than I'd expected. I repeated the step for my left eye, and all was good. I could see clearly again. Now, all I could do was hope for no headaches, and everything would be fine. It only took a few minutes for my worst fears to come to life. If I had thought the migraines were bad, this was nothing short of hell itself. My eyes began to feel as though someone had taken 2 needles and slowly forced them into the soft skin of the cornea, taking their time as if to bask in the horrific process. The pain moved its way from front to back, only stopping once it reached the end, just to begin spreading to the rest of my eyes. Until that moment, I hadn't realized it was possible to feel pain on the insides of your eyes. I couldn't have been more wrong. There is no more terrifying pain that I am aware of than to feel like your eyes are going to explode inside your head at any moment. I didn't know what to do. I was in too much agony to remove the contact lenses, but I had to try anyway. With blurry, tear-filled vision, I looked into the mirror in an attempt to remove them, only to see that my face looked nearly as bad as my eyes felt. There was a bloody discharge leaking from under each of my eyelids, running its way down my face and dripping into the bathroom sink. I was utterly horrified at the sight of it, nearly passing out as I tried to overcome the heavy shaking of my hands. I wasn't going to be able to do this. I had to call an ambulance. I found myself awaking yet again in the bed of a hospital. Only this time, when I opened my eyes, I could see nothing but darkness. I began to panic as I realized I couldn't see anything, not even a faint blur of light. Had the contact lenses somehow ruined my eyesight completely, or was it all due to the concussion I'd suffered in the car accident? Not knowing what else to do, I began to scream as I frantically searched for the call button. A nurse quickly made her way in, grabbing my arms in attempts to calm me down. "What is it, Mr. Jones? Are you feeling any pain?" the nurse asked, raising her voice to overcome my screaming. "I can't see," I shouted. "Please, I can't see. What is happening?" "Mr. Jones, it's just the bandages," she replied, bringing my hands up to my face to feel the gauze around my head. "See, your eyesight should be fine. We've just wrapped your eyes to give them time to recover before we subject them to light." I began to calm down enough to sensibly reply. "Recover? Why? What happened to my eyes?" "The doctor is on her way now, Mr. Jones. She will explain everything." As the nurse promised, it wasn't long before I could hear Claire's voice as she walked into the hospital. She politely asked the nurse to leave us alone so that she could explain to me what had happened. "Hello again, Thomas," she said, her tone just as calm and warm as ever. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, I guess. What happened to me? Am I going to be able to see?" "Yes, you should have no more issues with your eyes, Thomas. We had to do an unexpected surgery. Your eyes were beyond repair when you made it to the hospital. We had to give you new ones." "New eyes? Jesus Christ! Are you sure everything is going to be—" "Yes, Thomas," Claire interrupted. "As I told you, your sight is going to be fine. Now, listen to me. You've been extremely lucky to have found me. There are not many optometrists who could have saved your eyesight as I have." She paused for a long moment, leaving the room in complete silence. "I think you've suffered enough now, Thomas Jones," she continued. "I hope you've learnt your lesson." After a lingering pause, I decided to respond, feeling like I'd waited long enough so I wouldn't be interrupting her. Learned my lesson? What is that supposed to mean? No response. Claire? After a few more moments of silence, I decided to remove my bandages so we could finish the conversation. It took me several minutes to get them off, as they were heavily layered to keep my eyes from any light. When I finally got them off, I could see perfectly clearly. There was no pain, and even though Claire had told me there were new eyes, I didn't feel any different. As I looked around the room, I realized that Claire had left. I had to find her, to thank her for saving my eyesight, and I had to know what she meant from the last thing she said to me. Making my way out of the hospital room, I couldn't help but to notice the different colour of my new eyes as I passed by a mirror. My old eyes were dark brown, and these ones were a greyish blue. There was something familiar about them, but I couldn't quite put my finger on exactly what it was. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd come back to it later, and continued on my way to find Claire. I approached the nurse's counter outside my room as I looked for her and decided to ask the first person I saw where I might find her. Claire? You mean Dr. Wayne? She left the hospital in a hurry just a few moments ago. She had to catch a flight to return home. She mentioned she was only here to take care of one patient, which I'm guessing was you. I was in shock. Why would she have come here just to help me? It didn't make any sense. Dr. Wayne? I thought she didn't like to be called doctor. She told me... That was when it hit me. All of the pieces came rushing together. The payment plan, the free lenses, and now the surgery. The familiar look in my new eyes as I looked in the mirror. Alan Wayne was the name of the man I had killed on the highway that night. These were his eyes. I think you've suffered enough now, Thomas Jones, she told me. I hope you've learned your lesson. You may have asked yourself at least once in your life, if you could go back in time, what would you change? I never contemplated that question until recently, and now I think about it every day. Regret my decision to ever join that damned experiment. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have taken the pencil from Richard's desk and stabbed him in the neck over and over until he died. Jail time would be a small price to pay for that. Let me take it from the top. I work as an assistant in genetics at a college, which you may not have heard of before. Either way, to keep things safe, I won't disclose any important information to protect myself and anyone else who may be somehow related to the matter. Professor Richards was a prominent person in the college, adored by both students and his co-workers for his dedication to work, extensive knowledge, and ability to motivate his attendees to contribute in the lessons and outside of them. He often conducted projects here and there, small experiments to prove or debunk a theory or something else. And, more often than not, he had a plethora of student volunteers who were willing to do all the work for him. I rarely participated in any of the projects, save for when it really piqued my interest on a matter that I really wanted to see the results on. Richards trusted me the most and always gave me the most sensitive tasks to perform, passing on his knowledge onto me in the process. More often than not, he was like a fatherly figure to me, rather than a superior. He could probably sense that I grew up without a father's love, so he stepped in to take me under his wing. Now, when I look back, I start to realize that he probably never really cared, but needed someone that he could use for his twisted, insidious intentions. It all started a few months ago when he invited me into his office with a proposal he was very excited about. "How would you like to be a part of history, Victor?" he asked me, Of course, I was always willing to take up big projects, especially if there was a chance for recognition, so I immediately answered yes. Well, we have one big project upcoming, Richard said. The biggest one yet. If everything goes well with it, we'll be famous and rich. You'll never have to work as an assistant another day in your life. I asked him what this was about, and he handed me a folder. When I opened it, I saw, with big, bold letters, the name. The Fertility Project. In short, the documents described what the project would be about, who would participate, and how long it would last. The purpose of the project was simple: find female test subjects that were unable to conceive children and artificially impregnate them. Aside from Richards and I, there would be 12 volunteering students from the college and 5 female test subjects. I carefully reviewed the documents and saw that the project was funded by the college. Not that I had any suspicions about Richards' authenticity at the time anyway. He said that if I wanted to participate, I would have to sign an NDA and make sure not to tell anyone, under the threat of federal violation and long jail time. The same went for the students. If they told anyone about the project, including their family members, they risked getting kicked out of college and facing jail time. Although I disliked the idea of being chained down like that, at the time it seemed like a small price to pay for such greatness. I signed it, and Richards whipped out 2 Cuban cigars. Been saving these for a special occasion. Doesn't get any more special than this, he said as he gave one to me and lit it up. I was scheduled to meet Richards in the Biology and Genetics building in 2 days, and when I arrived, I was surprised to see a guardhouse instead of a gate and a guard sitting inside. The college had somehow managed to set this thing up seemingly overnight. The guard asked for my name, and I gave it to him, too confused and docile at the moment to refuse. The guard politely explained that, with the upcoming project, the college had to hire a security company to keep things safe. He said there were 5 guards in total, each stationed in a separate part of the campus, with one guard being in the biology building at all times. I asked if the guard knew what the project was about, but they seemed oblivious to it. All they knew was that they had to keep the college grounds safe from any suspicious or violent activities. I gave him a courteous smile and left to meet Richards. When I arrived, another guard stood in front of Richards' office and stopped me from entering. "It's okay, he's with me," Richards shouted, and the guard let me through. I went inside, and all of the project participants were there, including the students and the 5 female subjects. The subjects were women between the ages of 20 and 28, and while Richards and I were permitted to go home at the end of the day, the students and subjects had to remain inside the building at all times. "Professor Richards, we don't have adequate rooms for them to stay here," I said. "Everything has been arranged," Richard said. "The students will be staying on the 2nd floor, while the subjects will be on the 3rd floor. Since the project is so secretive, the guard is not permitted to leave the 1st floor. His job here will be to prevent anyone unwanted from entering the building, or in the worst case scenario, to stop students from leaving before the project is over. Unless they sign the paper to void the contract, that is, in which they would need to refund the college for the funds provided to the project. Trust me when I say, the funds are extremely high, and you probably wouldn't want to do it. Now, let's show you all to your rooms." My eyes widened when we went up to the 2nd floor, and I realized that 2 of the classrooms have been completely rearranged into unrecognizable rooms. Instead of chairs and desks, there were night tables and beds, giving off the impression of a dorm rather than a study building. The 3rd floor was even stranger, with the classrooms not only being rearranged, but the entire floor renovated to seemingly have a row of 5 doors which led into tiny cells. The women were each assigned a cell and locked. It was explained that this was for their own safety, but should they want to drop out of the experiment at any given moment, they were free to do so. Again, he emphasized the price they'd have to pay for such a choice. I started getting a bad feeling by this point. None of this seemed right, and no matter how many times Richard uttered the word voluntary, nothing seemed so about this. The students and the women seemed very enthusiastic, however, and were hanging on every word the professor said, obeying orders without questions. On the first day, the crew went to the lab and created a solution, which was to be put into vials and injected into the subjects. Each student had his own role, ranging from performing subject checkups, preparing food for the project members, taking blood samples, etc. My duty was to oversee the entire situation and assist if necessary, while providing medical help in case of emergency. At around 3 p.m, all initial tests had been completed, so Richards instructed the students to go back to their dorm rooms while he told me to follow him into his office. He sat by his computer, a wide grin on his face and the satisfaction of a job well done for the day. "I'll have one task for you, Victor," he said. "You may go home whenever you want, but what I may need your help with is monitoring the subjects. Come here." He gestured, and I went around his table to look at the PC screen. On the screen were 5 camera feeds monitoring the subject cells. "I'll be sleeping in the office," he said, "but if something comes up for me, I will need you to monitor the subjects." It sounded like an order, not a request. "Sure, Professor, you can count on me," I said, trying to hide my uncertainty. "All right. Well, that's it for the day. You can go home, get some rest. We have a lot of work ahead of us tomorrow." For days, nothing changed, and the crew performed their regular duties during the day. And then, about a week later, subjects 2 and 4 started to complain about the extreme isolation they were subjected to. They asked to be let out, but Richards outright refused, reminding them about the cost they would need to pay. Despite that, subject 2 protested, so Richards ordered one of the students to sedate her. He did as instructed, and the subject fell asleep. It was around 8 p.m. when I went into Richards' office to report the day's findings and realized that subject 2 was still asleep. "Professor Richards, the subject should not be asleep for that long," I said. "She shouldn't," he said, "but she's not sleeping. She's been euthanized." My eyes widened in terror. "What did you say?" I asked. "We couldn't risk letting her out. The student doesn't know what he did, so let's keep it that way. We don't want him racking himself with guilt." "Are you out of your mind? You killed her!" I raised my voice, to which he gave me a stern look. "Know your place, boy," he said. "This project is the most important thing we'll ever work on. We can't let it go to waste because some nobody decided to opt out and disclose secret information." "You can't be serious," I shouted. "I am," he said, "and subject 4 has been complaining as well. I'm going to need you to euthanize her." "That's out of the question." We had a heated discussion, and I told him I'd be leaving the project and reporting him to the police, when he whipped out the papers and showed them to me. He pointed to the section which showed that I agreed to be part of the project until it was finished, and that if there came to any misconduct, all participants would be treated as equally guilty. "You ass," I said. He simply smirked and told me to do my job, handing me the injection. I hesitated for a long time, but in the end, I had to do it. I was afraid of going to prison so much that I didn't care if I had to end someone else's life. That doesn't take away from the fact that I felt extremely guilty giving the patient an injection, while lying to her face that she'd be back to her husband tomorrow by noon. Richards even made me dispose of the bodies and made me agree on a story with him to tell the students that the subjects were released in the middle of the night. I agreed to everything he said, feeling sick to my stomach. He told me to go home and take the next day off. I did as he commanded, and needless to say, I got no sleep that night. I battled with myself the entire day on whether I should go to the authorities, but again, I was too selfish and afraid for myself to do so. When I returned to work the following day, I found Richards and the students in one of the classrooms, ecstatic. When I asked what was going on, Richard said, "Victor, we did it. Subjects 1 and 3 are pregnant. This is a huge breakthrough in science." My jaw dropped. I honestly haven't even thought about the potential success of the project, so I was surprised to say the least. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't excited myself. This was indeed a breakthrough in science. We wasted no time performing checkups on the subjects, taking blood samples, etc. Over the next few days, the subjects' weights had been increasing rapidly and their stomachs had grown in size. Ultrasound displayed the growth of the fetus at an abnormal rate, and we started to get a little worried, since the size we'd seen by then was not supposed to be visible by the first trimester, let alone after just 3 weeks. Richards ordered us to carefully monitor the subjects in case their health starts to slip up. And then came the worst day that I experienced during the project. It was day 26, I remember distinctly, and subject 1 was complaining about the severe pain in her stomach. I examined her, and her baby was kicking with extreme force, so much that I could see the bulges from the impact on the subject's stomach. I begged Richards to take the subject to a hospital, but he wouldn't hear it. He told me to give her some painkillers and get back into his office. By this time, the students were already asleep in their rooms, and since the cells on the 3rd floor were soundproof, not even the subjects from the adjacent cells heard the woman screaming, let alone anyone else. Richards and I observed subject 1 on camera as she writhed in pain. She banged on the floor, begging to be let out, after which she lay on the bed, holding her stomach and screaming in pure agony. I saw her stomach stretching out as if something poked it from the inside, and then her skin ripped open and a tiny hand emerged. Blood sprayed out like a fountain, and I saw a deformed, blood-covered head pop out, further opening the abdomen. The subject screamed, now more in terror than pain, as she helplessly watched the baby burst through her stomach. Only seconds later, her head dropped onto the bed and she stopped moving. The baby started crying, but it was a kind of cry I had never heard before. It sounded guttural and gurgling. "Victor, what are you waiting for?" Richards yelled. "Go take care of the baby." I stared at the thing on the camera, unable to move. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. It had an abnormally large head, extremities of unequal proportions, and a voice that sounded anything but human. It cried vigorously for a while, gradually losing its potency and going completely silent. "Victor!" Richards yelled again, but I was frozen in place. Richards violently stood up and stormed out of his office. I saw on the camera that he was entering cell 1. I came to my senses and figured that I had to ensure myself somehow, or stop the project. I browsed Richard's desktop and found the folder containing the details of the project. I glanced at the camera and realized that Richards was examining the dead baby and mother. I entered his email and sent all the details of the project to my email, nervously tapping on the desk as files transferred. Richards was done wrapping the bodies in a sheet and started coming back, so as soon as the email was sent, I deleted the sent email and returned to the camera feed, stepping away from the PC. Richards burst inside, beads of sweat forming on his temple. Are they dead? I asked. Of course they're dead, you idiot. I should report you to the project stakeholders for insubordination. Excuse me? If you had arrived in time, the baby subject could have survived. That's not true. I'm not even trained to handle this sort of situation. Richard sat in his chair and exhaled deeply, rubbing his eyes. The bodies are wrapped up. Take them into the basement, he said sternly. I dreaded the idea of carrying around a dead mother and her infant, but I didn't want to defy the professor right now to avoid arousing suspicion. I hauled the bodies downstairs and returned to Richard's office, who still seemed pretty mad. Go home, he said, staring at the screen of his computer. Professor, if you need help, I can leave. He didn't need to tell me again. I wished him a good night and left, still shaking. As soon as I got home, I downloaded the contents of the email and deleted any remaining evidence. I could use this somehow, but I was too tired and traumatized to think of a plan. I went to bed, the events of the night replaying in my head. That night, I kept having reoccurring nightmares of deformed, monstrous toddlers chasing me. When I woke up, I found the reality to be barely better than the haunting nightmares, but I had to go back to work. I knew Richards had me by the balls, and I had no choice but to comply with his demands. When I arrived, the students were going about their normal, everyday activities. Richards explained that he lied to the students and told them Subject 1 had to be taken to the hospital due to complications. I was appalled by his actions, but then remembered that I'm not that much different, so I stopped myself from judging him too much. Out of the 5 subjects, only 2 remained, Subject 3 and Subject 5. Subject 5 still showed no response to the treatment, and Subject 3's stomach kept growing rapidly. And then, just 2 days after the death of Subject 1, she gave birth. Richards was ready this time, having invested in an incubator, and he delivered the baby himself. The baby was just as deformed as the one from Subject 1. Richards separated the mother and the baby without even letting her take a look at her child, much to her protests. He ordered us to close the cell as he took the baby out. We had no choice but to comply, even the students who reluctantly followed his orders. Subject 3 cried for hours, but Richards muted the camera and focused on observing the baby in the incubator. 10 days later, the baby had grown in size enormously, reaching above 8 feet in height and over 390 pounds. It had grown long extremities. Its skin had become extremely hard, so needles could no longer penetrate it, and its face no longer resembled that of a human, with various lumps and visible deformities on it. That wasn't the only thing, though. A scan revealed that the creature itself had babies growing inside of it, at a seemingly fast pace, just like the babies of the subjects. Due to this, Richards dubbed the creature the Mother. The incubator could no longer sustain a creature of such a size, and I knew Richards could not possibly ask the college for more funds. I also knew he would not risk revealing the details of the project to the stakeholders, as they would shut it down immediately. He told me to take some time off and that he would let me know when my services were needed again. This was bad, because I knew he was up to no good. So, to occupy myself during the sleepless nights, I reviewed the project documents that I had stolen. Sure enough, 10 days later, Richards told me to resume my duties. When I arrived, I saw an electronic door, which hadn't been there before, in his office behind his computer. It led downstairs into a basement, which was expanded onto a huge area that resembled a laboratory. There were enormous test tubes filled with green liquid all over the place, with the biggest one being at the far end of the room. Mother was there, now much bigger than I remembered it to be, seemingly sleeping, and although its stomach was bulging, I could see more. smaller deformed creatures in nearby incubators. Richards filled me in on the details. The mother gave birth to 3 of them and continued to create more. The scan showed 2 more babies inside her stomach. In addition to that, it would seem that the babies also carried their own babies. They are extremely sick though, so I have dubbed them the rejects. The college approved this? I asked. Of course not. They don't know about this. I used my own funding to further the research. I realized then that there were only 9 students present in the building. Where are the other participants? I asked. Richards paused before answering. They were found dead in their rooms. Suicide. The weaklings couldn't live with the knowledge of what had to be done for greatness. I also realized that Subject 3 was gone. I didn't ask him where she was, or how he disposed of the bodies. That left us with only Subject 5 remaining. She was extremely malnourished and sick, as Richard saw no use in feeding or taking care of her. Over the course of the next few days, fewer and fewer students kept showing up. More committed suicide, whereas a lot of them were killed handling the babies. It soon became apparent that the creatures were toughening up quickly, their skin becoming hard, their speed and strength increasing way above humans. Richards had one of the grown versions placed inside the cell of the previous subjects and sent one subject to feed the creature. The creature was highly aggressive, so by the time it was done with the student, what was left of him was strewn all over the cell. Everyone was aware of Richard's intentions by then, but no one dared oppose him. A lifetime in prison to put anyone off from trying anything stupid, like reporting him to the authorities. Every day, he would emphasize multiple times how we would be rich by the time we are done, or how everyone would end up in life in prison if anyone decided to betray him. He knew exactly what to say to instill fear in his subordinates, including me. Out of all the project participants, only Richards, myself, and 3 more students remained by day 60, and I knew it was only a matter of time until it was my turn. Things were getting out of hand, and I knew I had to put a stop to this. Richards never let anyone down in the lab without his permission, and he was the sole holder of the keycard which opened the electronic lock. But that was of no interest to me. I had to get Subject 5 and the students out of there. Based on the conversations I've had with the guards, they were loyal to their company and not to Richards, so I knew I could trust them with some of the details. I scheduled my email containing all the project data to automatically be sent to the security company and the college 12 hours after I start my shift. I then pulled the guard from my building aside. I told him everything about the project and how most of the people were dead now, to which he seemed surprised and terrified. He agreed to wait until Richards went to sleep in his room, and that we would then unlock the cell and let everyone out. Before we managed to finalize our plan though, Richards called me into his office, interrupting us. I followed him there and stood in front of his desk as he stared at the computer screen for a while. When he decided it was time to pay attention to me, he looked up at me and said, "Victor, how are you feeling?" "I'm fine, Professor," I lied. "No, you're not. I can see it on you. This whole thing bothers you, I know it." "It doesn't. I'm okay with this." "Victor, you're a terrible liar. But I have something that might change your mind. Come with me." He opened the electronic door and led me downstairs. By now, most of the incubators had deformed creatures of various sizes inside of them, some of them much taller than humans, others the size of toddlers. Richards led me around and stopped in front of one of the incubators. "Look," he pointed, and my eyes widened. Inside of the test tube was a very small, perfectly healthy, perfectly normal human baby, given birth to by one of these monstrosities. He said, "You see, we achieved greatness. How is this possible? I believed there's a variety of factors. According to all the data I've gathered, there is a very, very small chance of a normal baby being born. But there is a chance. But that means the project is a failure. We would need to breed dozens, if not hundreds of these creatures in hopes of getting one healthy baby. No, it is not a failure, he rebuked. We're going down in history. Why can't you see this? I'm sorry, Professor, but the only thing you'll be remembered as will be a cold, heartless murderer who pretended to be a scientist. I know what the project truly is about. I've read your files, and I know you never intended to use the project for any so-called greatness. All you wanted was to make money, and this gives you a chance to sell these creatures as a weapon on the black market. And I also know that dropping out of the project never posed any threat to the participants. You lied to us. That's not... I've already contacted the security agency and the college. They will know everything soon enough. How dare you? He scoffed, before calming down. Well, no matter. He pulled out a pistol from behind his back and pointed it at me. The subject is a success, and the mother will be transferred to a new base for further research. I planned on killing off the students and the remaining subject tonight and offering you a chance to come with me. But since you know too much, you'll have to join them. You can kill me, but you won't get away with what you've done. You can't stop this, Professor. Just then, there was a sound of glass cracking behind Richards. He turned around in time to see one of the test tubes breaking, the green liquid pouring out. The creature inside stumbled out, voraciously gurgling and striding towards the Professor. Stay back! Richards fired a few shots into the creature, but it only flinched. And then, the mother opened her eyes. Her eyes were completely black, and yet despite that, I knew that her gaze was fixed directly on me. She groaned, emitting a deep vibration as the children raised their heads in response. More tubes broke, and before I knew it, the Professor and I were running back upstairs, Richards locking the door with his key card. There was a loud banging, and I turned around just enough to see a dent appear on the door. When we reached his office, Richards fumbled for his computer, frantically clicking. No, I can't let my data get destroyed, he said to no one in particular. The loud bang now resounded directly in the door behind Richards, but he seemed oblivious to it. I didn't stay to see what would happen to him. I ran the hell out as the bangs got louder, just in time to hear the door break and a cacophony of gunshots and monstrous screams ensue. Richards screamed in agony before his own voice got drowned out. The guard was there and had a visibly confused look on his face. There's no time, we gotta save the others, I shouted. No, there is no time. He grabbed me by the arm. The screams of those creatures resounded behind us, and I could see them emerging from Richard's office, covered in blood, with bloodthirsty looks in their faces. I stood there for a moment, contemplating my next action. But my cowardice took hold once more, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to make it if I went for the others. So instead, I listened to the guard, and we both bolted out of there. Go, go! Intervention will be here soon, the guard shouted as we ran. But only moments later, I heard him get grabbed as the monsters piled on top of him and ripped him into pieces. I ran outside and stopped only when I reached the gate. The guard who was there stopped me upon recognizing me, said that he was informed of the situation of the project. When I told him that there's been an outbreak, his eyes widened and told me to stay here while he investigates. I begged him not to go, mostly because I didn't want to be left alone. But my pleas fell on deaf ears, and he scurried off. I went inside the guardhouse to pick up the phone, only just then realizing that I had blood on my clothes. I had no idea how I had gotten it on me, but upon inspection, I realized it wasn't mine. I tried dialing 911, but there was no signal. Upon reading the guideline on the side, I realised that the phone only took calls but couldn't make them. I dropped the handset when I looked at the camera feed and saw one of the guards getting jumped by one of those creatures and getting ripped to pieces. They were everywhere, and most of the guards were dead. I couldn't stay there, or I'd die. I went out of the guardhouse and ran towards the wooded area, looking behind every now and again to make sure nothing was following me. After what felt like forever, my legs started to give way. I stopped to take a break. The campus was far behind me, and no one followed me. From there, I made my way safely home. Out of all of the participants of the Fertility project, I was the only confirmed survivor later on. I have no idea what exactly happened, but I heard that the biology building had a pipe explosion which caused the entire place to come down. Whether it was that or something else, I'm glad, because it hopefully killed the mother and her nasty children. I wake up every night seeing her black, penetrating gaze through the test tube, and I feel as if she knows where I am at all times, despite not seeing me. The guilt of letting those poor students and subjects die racks me every day as well. I don't feel sorry for the human baby that most likely got killed though. Nothing good could have come out of those monsters. The only consolation I have is the fact that Richards died before he could fully weaponize and sell his project. The authorities are after me now, and I don't know if they intend to sentence me to a life in prison, but I'll make it easy for them. There's a gun next to me, and when I'm done with this, I'm going to use it. Hopefully, I'll be able to sleep peacefully again, for the first time in many months. I remember the first time Pete said it, as if he'd been thinking it for a long time, as if it wasn't just booze talking. Said it like it was a matter of fact, a truth, not an opinion. I want to crawl out of my own skin. I sat in silence, held my beer with both hands, watching the campfire die. The night was loud, and for a while I let the noise wash over me, cicadas, birds, and rustling of the leaves. I didn't know what to say, to be honest. His daughter had died a year ago, in a car crash that he'd survived. He'd been left with a divorce settlement, a scar on his neck, and a gaping hole in his life. If that confession didn't convince you that he wasn't coping, then maybe the puffy bags under his eyes would, or the nails chewed to the bone, or the way he'd sigh every morning like he almost couldn't bear the thought of another day. He spat, reached for the whiskey bottle by the base of his chair, fumbled it. I was trying to find the words, picking at the label of my beer with a thumbnail while he spoke up again. I was drinking, Jim. I looked at him closely, watching the way the alcohol made his head wobble, the way the confession had him haunched over the dirt. Pete, you weren't. Kenny breathalyzed you on the scene. Had to do it whilst you held her body. Told all of us about it. Told us you scored a perfect 0. Pete looked at me, clenched his jaw. Kenny I've known since I was in diapers. Kenny who met his wife because I told her that he was the funniest man I'd ever met, even when he couldn't tell a joke for crap. Kenny who was going to walk my daughter down the aisle if I ever... He stopped, his face contorted with pain. I could see 2 clear channels down his cheeks, his tears clearing the day's grime. Damn. We were silent for a little longer. He retreated into his grief before taking a deep swig, steeling himself to continue. I watched him run a finger absent-mindedly over the tattoo I had always hated, his daughter's name in gaudy cursive across the back of his hand. I remember the day he'd got it. Told me that the tattoo artist wouldn't do names on principle, but that when he explained that it was his little girl, and that because of her he was 6 months clean, the guy practically had no choice. He spoke again, quieter this time. I was drinking, Jim. 5, maybe 6 beers. I thought I'd be fine. Another pause. I'm too scared to die. I'm a coward like that. Always have been. I just want it to stop. I want to crawl out of my own skin. He stood up and staggered to bed. I thought there'd have been more, if I'm honest, but that seemed to be it. He seemed to be content with just letting me know, almost as if he was saying it to himself, as if it was important that he verbalized it. I had a hard time sleeping myself. First, I had to try and ignore the sounds of Pete's grief, rustling my sleeping bag, noisily taking a pee, doing all the zips I could find. I could tell he was trying to hold it in, but sometimes it would burst out, and it's an ugly thing, hearing a grown man sob. Second, once I had settled for the night, I was left with the thought that there was something weird about the trail. My father-in-law had said it was Skinwalker territory, although I didn't much know what that meant. Something bad, I suppose. Something dangerous. So I'd imagine what these Skinwalkers looked like in the dark, wondering if the snapping of the twigs or the startled flight of birds was their fault. I imagined them as men with antlers, or as women with the heads of turtles or owls. This particular night, I heard something unusual. Pete was speaking. Sure, it was a whisper, but Pete was speaking to something which would reply in low grunts and hisses, something that made noises I couldn't quite explain, and I spent a while building up the courage to undo the zip of my tent just an inch so I could take a peek. But every time I moved, they'd stop. I was certain of it. Pete was talking to someone, or something, in the night. And there was this smell. Something goaty and musky, like a barn or rancid meat. And it was so strong that even when I covered my nose, it seemed to stick to my skin. I must have passed out listening, because I awoke, with my head next to the entrance of my tent, to the sounds of Pete making breakfast. I stumbled blearily from the tent. "Bad dreams?" asked Pete. I nodded. He looked at the beer cans around the fire, then back to me, smiled. I hadn't seen him so calm, so himself since the accident, and I didn't want to jinx it by asking about last night. Instead, I mumbled in agreement as he suggested we split up for the day, seeing as it was the anniversary of the accident, the unspoken reason for this whole trip, and I busied myself with clearing up the campsite, plotting my day's trip on a map in red pen. About an hour after Pete left, I noticed it, and was surprised that it had taken me that long to see it in the first place. All the grass and plants around Pete's tent had rot overnight. Flowers had withered, the grass had gone a dirty shade of brown, and a small trail led into the woods that was made entirely of rotten foliage. There was even, I noticed, a rotten mouse at the edge of our campsite, which had decayed so much that I could see the white of its tiny ribs and a small mass of maggots inside. I sat for a while, thinking of Pete, and of what could have caused this. Maybe it was like this when we got here, and we couldn't see it, the half-light of the evening obscuring our view, and the mouse had been there all along. Things do die after all, and it wasn't like there was any way of disposing of corpses out in the woods. I suppose things just rotted, under bushes and in the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was wrong, and that I was spinning myself a story to ease the anxiety, to ease the sense that something had happened last night which shouldn't have. My walk that day was short, maybe an hour or two, and I returned to the campsite and read for the rest of the day, waiting for Pete to return. He appeared as the sun was beginning to set, appearing from the rotting foliage, carrying some sort of small sculpture made from thin branches. It was a strange thing. The branches had been tied together to make some sort of humanoid figure, and there was a parting in its chest, which Pete seemed to have filled with some rotting substance or other, something like black sludge. I think he noticed me raise an eyebrow because he gave a short, strange laugh. I know, it's a little weird, sure, but I've had all this energy today, being a year since. He tailed off, and I watched his eyes glaze over for a second before pulling himself back out. Figured I'd do something to take my mind off it, is all. I didn't have the heart to ask any further questions. He'd lost more than a daughter. She was only 2. He'd lost her whole life. He'd lost the first day of school, her first real Christmas, her sports matches and her graduations, her weekends and her heartbreaks, her laugh. He'd lost seeing himself as a father, a grandfather, lost seeing her love something the way he loved her. If this was his way of dealing with it all, then so be it. He'd always been a talented carpenter, until he quit a few months ago, and so I wasn't surprised he channeled all of that into something like this. He insisted he quit because he drank too much, although I've always thought that it was because he couldn't bear spending all day looking at a name on the back of his hand. We spent that night around the campfire as old friends. For a few choice moments, you wouldn't have known anything had happened. But about an hour after I got into my sleeping bag, I could smell it again. That goat musk and meat smell. And I heard Pete unzip his tent, and the quiet snap of branches that suggested he was making his way into the forest. I couldn't just let that happen. Maybe it was an urge to protect him, or maybe it was just curiosity. But I followed Pete deep into the forest, following the smell and the rotting vegetation, using my torch every now and again when I was confident he wouldn't be able to see. After a while, I didn't need to use my torch anymore. In fact, a warm, flickering light came through the trees like long, orange fingers. A fire. I made sure to keep my distance, staying as quiet as possible and finding an elevated position where I could see the fire from the trees without being seen myself. Although I'm still not sure I can entirely believe what I saw. There, in that clearing, stood Pete, naked as the day he was born. And around the fire were dark figures, shapes I couldn't recognize, shapes that shifted and made and unmade the light, shapes that I knew were watching him. And he was speaking to them, under his breath, eyes wide, his little wooden figure in his hands. And as he spoke, he got faster and faster, and I could see the whites of his eyes begin to shrink, and the figures grew closer, leaping into the space the shadows afforded them. And he took one deep, final breath before throwing the figure into the fire. There was silence. The fire faltered for a minute, and then the skin on Pete's chest began to move. It began to move as if it were a thin fabric being pressed from the other side, stretching outwards, as if something from inside was testing it. And Pete's mouth opened, and his tongue was black, and I could see now that it was hands that were pressing against the skin of his chest, until the skin tore, and instead of blood, 5 black fingers emerged, and they pulled the rest of the skin like cloth, tearing it, revealing more black. It was like a balloon deflating in slow motion. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, or have ever seen since. Some small and hunched figure, the colour of an oil slick, the same deep black and with the same shimmer, was tearing its way out of Pete's body, limb by limb, clambering out of the hole in his chest, tearing his belly the way you'd gut a rabbit, until there was enough room for its leg to reach out, and another leg, and finally it forced the top of its head through the bottom of what was Pete's throat, and his skin collapsed in a heap around it. The figures around the edges of the fire suddenly burst into a frenzy of noise, metallic and wet and animal all at once, and I could see their shapes for fractions of a second. Figures with needle teeth and antlers, Women with mouths for breasts and bare hands, squat four-legged creatures that were dripping with scales, and figure after figure that were comprised of things I could not name. The thing that Pete was, the black, hunched figure, let out a scream. The borders of this figure were uncertain and shifting. They were like made of TV static. It moved around on all fours, and after sniffing the skin it had left behind, bound into the forest. There was silence for a while, as if the figures around the fire dissipated. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. When people ask me now, 10 years later, what happened to Pete, I tell them he wandered off into the night on a hike. It's not a complete lie, and there's a sort of comforting finality in it for some people. They can believe it, that Pete was overcome by grief and walked until he collapsed, or was taken by some wild animal, or fell into some natural gorge that he couldn't climb out of. They sigh and shake their heads, and some will even go as far as to give me a look like I'm not telling the whole truth, but they accept it. What I don't tell them, what I don't even tell my wife, is that I spent the month before the anniversary of her death at yard sales in other cities. I pose as a new parent, or increasingly as I get older, a grandparent, and I buy baby clothes. I tell my family I'm taking a week to remember Pete, to follow the same trail we did as the last week we had together. Maybe they think I'm looking for him. Maybe they think it's my own way of dealing with it all. Regardless, they ask few questions and let me go. And every year, on the anniversary of her death, and I suppose his, I make my way to the charred remains of that campfire, and I place a bundle of baby clothes on the black dirt. And I wait, and I watch, as night falls, and my eyes gradually adjust to the dim light of the stars and the moon. A small black figure emerges from the undergrowth. I watch in silence as the thing that was Pete takes the baby clothes in its arms and holds them until morning. Holds them until they turn threadbare in his arms. Until, like the grass and plants and the mouse, they rot